And Mark Steyn, let's jump right into it. You have probably written more fulsomely and more thoughtfully, and certainly with more devastating wit than anybody I know, about what I call the war for the free world.
Right.
The war we're in, that so few of us, and most especially, I'm sorry to say, the Obama administration, seem to comprehend. Give us in just not a soundbite, but a short paragraph or two, your take on the nature of the enemy that we're facing and what makes it so dangerous.
Well, I think if you look on it, as we tend to, from our prosperous Western citadels, then this is simply no contest. We're the richest, most powerful, most advanced society that human civilization has ever known. So we should be able to knock these guys out in nothing flat. And if it's a quick war, that's what you'd bet on. If it's a quick, short, decisive military engagement, then you bet on the people who have got the best tanks and the best bombers, the state-of-the-art equipment, and the best trained warriors. Right. But if it's a long war, other factors come into play, like will. Basic societal, civilizational will. Mm-hmm. And Islam has made a bet with Western civilization that they are the ones with the will. They can take it for longer. I think when you look at the Obama administration's policies, or lack of policies, really, in Afghanistan at the moment, you begin to see what Islam means on that. That after we went in there in the fall of 2001, we took out the Taliban in nothing flat. They scrammed up into the hills. Now here we are 8 years later, and the president is musing openly about permitting the Taliban back to power in Afghanistan, with all the consequences that would have for Pakistan and the wider world.
Actually welcoming them back, it seems, not just permitting them, but saying these folks weren't, after all, the problem. It's just this natty bunch of Al-Qaeda that we need to worry about. And oh, by the way, I guess the Taliban across the border is considered still to be a problem, at least for our friends in Pakistan. So I mean, the incoherence of this is unbelievable. But you're right; they do seem intent on transmogrifying these guys into somehow now part of the solution, not the problem.
Yes, and of course this is on its face ridiculous. I mean, these two organizations, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, are not separate. The Mullah Omar, one of his wives was one of Osama bin Laden's daughters, and Osama bin Laden, one of his wives, was one of Mullah Omar's daughters. I mean, they're linked in every which way.
I guess it's convenient to have the option to have multiple wives that you can marry into a lot of different families at the same time.
Exactly. I mean, I'm not saying that narrows it down in the same way it might if you were in some backwoods Appalachian town.
Well, not necessarily. Let's leave Appalachia out of this.
but what we're seeing, what we're seeing there is, as you say, an incoherent strategy. How can you expect the Pakistani government in Islamabad to crack down on the Taliban if you're preparing to do business with them across the border in Afghanistan and admit them back into government? Right. And the idea that the Taliban were just these sort of benign landlords to Al-Qaeda, I think is completely preposterous. Wherever you are in the world, you can, and I'm not just talking about Indonesia or the Belsen, the schoolhouse bombing in Russia, or the Balkans, Bosnia. I'm also talking about London and Toronto and pretty much everywhere on the planet. You can find young jihadists who passed through those Afghan training camps in the 1990s. The idea that suddenly the Taliban are this reasonable group that we can do business with communicates to the wider world that America is simply not serious about this.
Yeah, and that's what I want to get at a little bit further, because I think this prospect that we have indeed these folks inside our countries who have trained, maybe it's not Afghanistan, but many of them did, but certainly in Taliban-run Pakistani camps or Al-Qaeda's camps or Jamaat al-Fukra's camps or Hamas's camps or Hezbollah's camps or whatever. And you know, what I'm struck by, Mark, and I just love your thoughts on this, is when we hear folks tell us, as we did so frequently in the aftermath of the bust of the guy who we were told wanted to blow up subways in New York, or the guy who wanted to blow up a skyscraper in Dallas, or the guy who wanted to blow up a courthouse in Springfield, Illinois. There's no connection between these guys. It strikes me as, it's like saying there's no virus behind swine flu outbreaks.
Yes.
How can you expect people to contend with this, let alone defeat it, if you want to ignore, if you insist on ignoring what are, in fact, the underpinnings? I call it, because that's what they call it, Shariah. But how on earth can we possibly defeat these guys if we are continuing to ignore that deep connection between them?
Yes, we don't want to take on the ideology because it's problematic. Right. That's basically a decision that has been made, perhaps not even consciously, by the political class, that you can't fight the ideology. And yet if you don't fight the ideology, you're going to have this popping up all over the map. Because the great advantage, it's not like the Cold War, where the KGB had to have put deep sleepers in and have handlers and have elaborate systems for them to meet in parks and leave messages in trash cans and all the rest of it. Right. You don't need that here. You've got a highly decentralized network that simply responds to the ideology. So you'll have some guy who's in Minneapolis, and he suddenly gets a yen to go back to Somalia and kill a bunch of people. Right. And that
or
is
perhaps
a huge
simply
advantage.
Stay here and kill a bunch of people, as
yes.
the case may be. But he doesn't need direction to do it, is your point.
No, he doesn't need a control officer or anything. This idea that somehow there's an organization called Al-Qaeda, and it has a chairman and a chief executive and a board of directors and subsidiary branch officers, I think is a completely reductive way of looking at what we're up against.
Yeah, reductive is a fancy, highfalutin 50-cent word for absurd.
Yes, completely.
Reductive. Okay, just wanted to check how you translate that into regular English.
Yeah, if you want to take it down, I think absurd is like a 25-cent word. Let's take it a full nickel and just say it's dumb.
Dumb.
It's a dumb way of doing
it. Good. Listen, we're going to pause for just a moment, but before we do, I want your take on the idea that sort of flows from all of this, that there's no ideological problem or no wellspring of the ideology that we need to be concerned about. Which is the idea that what we want to do, particularly with these characters that we're trying to get desperately out of Guantanamo Bay to meet the president's arbitrary deadline of closing that place at the end of the year, we're going to send them to Saudi Arabia to be rehabilitated. Mark Steyn, what do you make of that proposition?
I mean, this, I think, gets back to the idea of not being able to address the ideology. I mean, there is a very high, when these guys leave Gitmo, there's already a very high recidivist rate. I mean, a lot of them have been killed and captured subsequently on the battlefield. But the idea that you can rehabilitate them by sending them to Saudi Arabia is crazy.
It's sending a drunk to a saloon to dry out.
And sending them to a saloon where it's permanently happy hour.
Yeah,
I mean, basically,
free drinks
Saudi Arabia,
on the house.
Saudi Arabia is the source of the ideological infection.
Right.
That's really spread around the planet.
Yeah, the very petri dish for the virus that I'm analogizing to. Mark Steyn, we'll be pausing for moments here, but we're going to delve into something that I know is near and dear to your heart and should be near and dear to the hearts of everybody who has just enjoyed our first segment with you, Mark Steyn, and that is the proposition that people who are afflicted with this virus are poised to keep you, Mark Steyn, and for that matter, the rest of us, from enjoying free speech.
You're listening to Secure Freedom Radio.
Now more from Frank Gaffney.
On the issue of the relationship between freedom of expression and freedom of religion or belief mentioned in paragraph 38, my delegation would like to emphasize that the episode of the offensive publication of portraits of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in the media in some countries has highlighted the damage that freedom of speech, if left unchecked, may lead to, not only by hurting the religious feelings of more than 1 billion people, but also to their freedom of religion and their right of respect for their religion.
Welcome back to Secure Freedom Radio. We are in the midst of a most special edition of the program with the author, the columnist, the general brilliant contributor to the War of Ideas, Mark Steyn. And that clip, Mark, was an Ambassador Ihab Gamaladin speaking, I guess 2 years ago now, almost to the day, before the Human Rights Council of the United Nations about something that you obviously do in an egregious way, which is to say hurt the religious feelings of more than 1 billion people. And I understand that you've actually been prosecuted for such misconduct. Shed light on both what is going on here and what you've been doing about it.
Well, the Canadian Islamic Congress complained about an excerpt from my book, America Alone, that appeared in Canada's biggest news magazine, Maclean's, which is like, I guess, Time and Newsweek combined. And they took me and Maclean's to 3 human rights commissions at the federal level in Ontario and in British Columbia, where I was for a week-long trial, one day of which...
You might just say, Mark, because we are not probably as familiar as we should be with the sort of star chambers of these human rights commissions in Canada. What are they, and how do they operate?
Well, they're basically a kind of drive-through justice that sprang up in the
not to be confused with drive-by shooting.
Yeah, well, it often feels like that if you're on the receiving end.
Yeah, I imagine.
The traditional protections of common law, the right to confront your accuser in open court, the defense of truth, the presumption of innocence, all these things are gone here because they were designed for a multicultural age that the left thought was going to be very easy. They thought it was going to be, for example, nice Jews against old ancient Nazis. They thought it was going to be gay people against homophobic people. They thought it was going to be nice black people against racist whites. Well, then you have these Islamic lobby groups in Canada and elsewhere in the West that are prepared to use the tools of multiculturalism to advance essentially a unicultural agenda. And you heard it very clearly.
Unicultural meaning
by unicultural,
supremacy
I mean,
of Islam.
That we all, in effect, have to live under the strictures of Shariah, of Islamic law. Yeah. That Egyptian ambassador makes the point. A Muslim doesn't believe you should draw or paint representations of Muhammad. Now, there are some very famous ones that have been used.
Like on the Supreme Court of the United States.
Yes, and in many, you'll find them in European museums, in many history books too. You'll find it in Dante's Circle of Hell, which has been illustrated by many prominent artists. I quite accept that if you're a practicing Muslim and you don't believe you should have representations of the Prophet, that's fine for you as a Muslim. But for the many people around the world who aren't Muslims, that's something they can choose or not choose to observe as they see fit. And what this Egyptian ambassador is proposing is that essentially the whole planet now will live under a de facto Islamic law. Right. That what Muslims believe, you as a Christian or a Buddhist or a Jew or whatever are also obliged to sign on to too. And what I find scary about that, I mean, there's no surprise that an Egyptian ambassador from a country that has no freedom of speech should say such things. But what is more problematic to me is the number of, for example, European foreign ministers who would gladly agree with him. They think, for the sake of a quiet life, that they should string along with that. That in a way you can have Sharia light. You can write a couple of stops on the Sharia Express. You won't have to go all the way to female circumcision and beheadings and all the rest of it.
Stonings.
But you can just go a couple of stops down the line and then get off at some sort of reasonable point before you've gone too far down the track.
It's the local, not the express.
Yeah, that's right. And you'll be surprised, by the way, how fast that express train goes once you're
and the doors don't open at your stop.
That's right. That's right.
Well, and this is all the more appropriate because one of the fellows that I know you have admired, as I have, for having suffered, in fact, his travails continue after years have, I guess, been wrapped up relatively satisfactorily, though we do want to hear about your appearance before the Parliament in Canada about all that. But Geert Wilders, or Geert Wilders, depending on how you want to pronounce it, the Dutch parliamentarian, is being prosecuted in his own country, Netherlands, arguably the most tolerant of all of the Europeans, pursuant to precisely this kind of idea, right?
Yes. And I think that's you use the word tolerance. The Netherlands is supposedly the most tolerant country in Europe. It has, in the army, you're allowed to have long hair. They've got legalized pot. They've got legalized prostitution. They've got legalized everything. Right. And what they have only just begun to realize is if you're the most tolerant country in Europe, and you import large numbers of people from a culture that even at its most benign has no particular track record for tolerance, your society is going to change. Yeah. I think I say somewhere in America alone that when people used to talk about Iraq as an artificial entity and the Kurds and the Shia and the Sunni, they don't all fit together. It's silly to try and fit them together in one country. It's an artificial notion. Well, what do you call the modern-day city of Amsterdam, where you have essentially an Islamic republic in embryo living side by side with the sort of hippie anything goes, pot, drugs, sex, whatever you bag.
Side by side for the moment, but soon on top. Before we get to the unholy alliance that Obama has now forged with the Organization of the Islamic Conference, just give us a little bit more flavor of your testimony with, I guess, Ezra Levant, another Canadian who was prosecuted in this, as I say, star chamber up in Canada. But you testified recently with Ezra before your parliament. I don't know if it's your parliament anymore. You're here more than you're there, I gather. But your home of origin, I guess they call it.
Unlike Geert Wilders, who was,
a man without a country,
who was kicked out of Heathrow Airport, I'm still allowed to drive across the border.
Well, thank God for that.
Into Canada.
If only to stand trial.
I got a very warm welcome, oddly enough, at the House of Commons in Ottawa, and Ezra and I were testifying to the House of Commons Select Committee on Justice about getting the Section 13 hate speech law basically scrapped. We think, my view is if you're going to have a so-called multicultural society, you don't need sensitivity training, you need insensitivity training. The only way it's going to work is if we all develop thick skins and learn to rub along together. And this idea, which I'm very concerned about, that it seems to come naturally to the Canadian and European political class and to at least 50% of the American political class, that somehow government, you can have countries made up of hostile identity groups with government as the sole legitimate arbiter of the relations between those groups. I think that is the death of liberty. We're seeing it already in Europe. And I think we've made modest progress toward reversing it and restoring liberty in Canada. And I'm concerned that even as we're doing that, we're seeing reverses in the United States, in Europe, and at the United Nations.
Yes, let's talk about those. As you say, you're campaigning now in Canada to ban this so-called hate speech, which is a practical matter, means banning or at least constricting freedom of expression at the very moment that the U.S. Congress is enacting hate speech legislation. And simultaneously, we've got the Obama administration joining forces with this, I call it the Muslim Mafia, though there's now a new book by that name, so I'm going to have to come up with a new name.
Right.
The Organization of the Islamic Conference to make this sort of international norm, banning such freedom of expression. Talk to us about what you think this leads inevitably to here in the United States.
Well, I think the Organization of the Islamic Conference is a voting bloc of, I think it's 57 or 58 nations now, including some countries like Russia, which increasingly have an interest in forging an alliance with that Muslim bloc in a very practical sense. And they dominate the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is, in fact, an anti-human rights council. Yeah. It's not about rights.
It's Orwell.
Yeah, it is. It's an Orwellian use of the term. Human rights, to me, defined by what the barons did to King John at Magna Carta in 1215. Magna Carta says to the king, the subjects have the right to constrain. The subjects have the right to constrain the king, and to me, that is what human rights are. They're freedom from government. Mm-hmm. They're limitations upon the state. What the Organization of the Islamic Conference, in concert, I regret to say, with the Obama administration, is doing at the planetary level at the UN Human Rights Council, is saying no. The state, and if necessary, the international body of the United Nations, has the right to constrain individuals right across the planet and insert, in effect, a planetary-wide group defamation law preventing anyone discussing Islam. I think that's a tragedy for the planet, and I'm very sad. I'm saddened that the Obama administration is willing to trade basic American principles away for some temporary photo op with thug states like Egypt.
Yeah, and that really is the underlying point of the Organization of the Islamic Conference, to say nothing of the Human Rights Council, is they're all run by thugocracies of one kind or another, and they are, at their very core, as individual nation states, the antithesis of human rights. And so you get them together in one or the other of these gatherings, mafia, whatever you want to call them, and it's very unlikely that they're going to take much time to be troubled with the essence of human rights and freedom. And in fact, I'd like to play a clip here of an exchange in that Human Rights Council just to make this point dramatically. Let's go to 1504. This is
from around the world of torture, persecution, and violence against women. What has this council pronounced? What has it decided? Nothing. Its response has been silence, but that would be inaccurate. This council has, after all, done something. It has enacted one resolution after another, condemning one single state, Israel. They seek to demonize Israeli democracy, to delegitimize the Jewish state, to scapegoat the Jewish people. They also seek something else, to distort and pervert the very language and idea of human rights.
If you would kindly listen to me, I am sorry that I'm not in a position to thank you for your statement. I should mention that I will not tolerate any similar statements in the Council. The way in which members of this Council were referred to, and indeed the way in which the Council itself was referred to, all of this is inadmissible.
Well, there you have it. The first making the point that all that the Human Rights Council seems to do is to assail Israel, a nation that actually does respect human rights. And then the latter was a translation of Ambassador Luis Alfonso de Alba, I believe a Spaniard, if I'm not mistaken, president of the Human Rights Council back in March, saying that kind of speech is really impermissible in the council itself. So, again, Mark, this just it seems as though it's almost surreal that we're witnessing the nation, the world, indeed, turned on its head as part of what I would describe as, and Robert Spencer has written an entire book on the subject, the sort of stealth jihad of these Shariah adherent types. That's the counterpart to the violent part that we talked about before the break.
Yes, and they function, the violent jihad of the young men on the Afghan-Pakistani border and the stealth jihad or the soft jihad. They function as a good cop, bad cop routine. Basically, there are significant forces throughout the world who basically share all the aims of Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, but they just don't want to fly planes into skyscrapers to achieve them. Yeah. And they're much shrewder, in fact, than the guys who want to fly planes into skyscrapers, because they've figured out that there's no point destroying those skyscrapers when you can take them over and they'll fall into your hands simply through the pusillanimity of many Western leaders as represented in bodies like the UN Human Rights Council. In other words, the West is so weakened and so enfeebled that it will give you everything you want just for promising that you won't blow things up. I know you're very big on Sharia finance.
Yeah. Big on it being against it.
Yeah, you're big
more
on
accurately.
being against it. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't agree with you. It's just debuted, for example, at the Toronto Stock Exchange this very week. Gordon Brown says he wants the United Kingdom to be the world leader in Sharia finance.
He does.
In other words, it's not just that many Western Muslims share all the aims of Osama bin Laden. For example, if you poll young Muslims in Ireland, 40% of them would like Ireland to become an Islamic state. What on earth? We've spent decades thinking the whole problem in Ireland was something to do with Catholics and Protestants, and young Muslims are saying no.
They were left out.
Nuts to all that. It's going to be Sunni versus Shia.
Clearly, Mark, you understand this. Their feelings were hurt. They didn't have a piece of the action, so now they want the whole country to be Muslim. And as you know, Britain is at the moment being roiled by this mass demonstration of Muslims that is going to be insisting that Sharia be applied not just to Muslims there, but to everybody in lieu of the common law. So here we are, and I just wanted to introduce another wonderful contribution made to this front in the War of Ideas by Daniel Henninger. In today's Wall Street Journal, he's doing a piece on the Nobel Peace Prize, awarded to our president by a gaggle of left-wing Norwegian parliamentarians. He calls it a decadent Nobel. And he uses that as sort of the theme of this thing, and I think that's what you're getting at as well, is that they've taken our measure, they've found us to be not only feckless but decadent, and that makes us ripe for the stealth jihad.
Yes, and I think that's why they gave the president the award. I remember at the time of all the birth certificate controversy, whenever it was, I said, I would very much doubt.
Some think it's still going on.
I said I'd very much doubt Barack Obama was born in Kenya. It sounds far more likely to me that he was born in Stockholm.
Yeah.
He's the first Scandinavian prime minister to be president of the United States.
Yeah.
And the trouble is that won't work. The only reason that Sweden can get away with being Sweden, and Norway can get away with being Norway, and Belgium can be Belgium, and Germany can be Germany, is because America's America. Somebody has to play the role of America in the world. And if the United States is not prepared to do that, we forget what a relatively smooth period, very violent, but in terms of global order, we have had a very smooth transition of power. There was 1 month in 1943, I think it was, when Britain had more men under arms than the United States, and sometime in the course of that month it changed, and the United States had more men under arms. 1943, I think it is.
Yeah.
And in a sense, the order maker on the planet passed from being the British Empire to the United States. 2 civilizations, 2 cultures, 2 nations, very close, very similar to each other, as close as you could possibly get. And the idea that in the post-American era you're going to have anything like a smoother transition of the order maker, I think is crazy. I mean, that's the idea that you can just shrug off American power in the world and life will go on, which is what these left-wing Norwegians seem to believe, I think is completely deluded.
Yeah, we're going to go further into that with Mark Steyn, our friend and mentor on so many of these ideas, specifically on what the post-American world that Barack Obama seems bent on creating will mean for you.
You're listening to Secure Freedom Radio.
Now more from Frank Gaffney.
When we did a review of what the prior administration had decided about missile defense in Europe, we concluded it didn't meet the threat that we were worried about. We do not believe Russia and the United States pose a threat to one another. What we believe is that these other actors pose threats to both of us. So we have offered for the closest cooperation between the United States and Russia. We would be happy to be making these decisions jointly with Russia.
Did you hear that? That was Hillary Clinton, our Secretary of State, obviously just in the caught up in the spirit of détente with the Russians and offering to make decisions about missile defense with the Russians. Mark Steyn, you were talking before the break about the postAmerican world, and this obviously suggests a different kind of world than the American world, American-dominated world, if you will, Pax Americana. There is presumably not just a transition issue here that could be untidy, as you were saying, but there is the proposition that somebody else, probably not to our liking, is going to fill the vacuum that America has filled, I think, so admirably, by and large, since World War II. What are we to make of the possibility that seems implicit in Secretary of State Clinton's remarks that we want it to be the Russians?
Yes. Putin, who was openly contemptuous in his condescension toward Mrs. Clinton, before she'd even left the country, actually put it very well. I mean, he dismissed completely the idea that there was any quid pro quo involved in deciding to abandon missile defense in Poland and the Czech Republic. He made it clear that he regards the United States as a bunch of saps, and that as far as he's concerned, Eastern Europe has been returned to Russia's sphere of influence. And you'd be surprised how far west his definition of Eastern Europe extends. He believes that the entire continent, which is dependent in terms of its gas supply on Russian energy, has nothing to fear from an Iranian nuclear program, because in a sense it will be under a Russian security umbrella. And I think this is what we're going to see around the world now, that as people realize that the only way Obama can accomplish his domestic agenda is by retreating from global responsibilities, then regional power brokers here and there on the map will actually start asserting themselves, and that's going to be very bad news if you happen to be in their neighborhood.
Yeah, let's talk about a couple of those neighborhoods quickly, Mark. Iran. You've written that neutrality is really not an option vis-a-vis Iran. The Grand Ayatollah may or may not be comatose, may or may not be in worse shape, but Iran seems certainly to have taken our measure, and I gather you think is one of those regional hegemons in the making. What will that portend for the region?
Yes, I don't think people have a clue how destabilizing this is going to be. Essentially, the modern Middle East was invented by the British and the French over lunch in 1922, I mean, to all intents and purposes, and was then set in stone by the American relationship with Saudi Arabia and certain other nations beginning in the post-war era. This destroys all that at a stroke. Iran going nuclear, I think, will loose all kinds of dangerous toxins around the region and make it entirely impervious to Western influence. After all, we've seen the United States trying to influence Iran to no effect now for 3 or 4 years. This isn't like Pakistan and India going nuclear, both of which are American allies, at least in the formal sense, in the case of Pakistan. This is a country that has explicitly been at war with the United States in the most fundamental way for 30 years, and it's been able to cock a snook at the entire Washington establishment and say, we're now a nuclear power. This will have enormous repercussions. It's the Bernard Lewis line that the problem for the United States is it risks being seen as harmless as an enemy and treacherous as a friend.
Yes.
And when you look at Obama, what he did to Poland vis-a-vis Mrs. Clinton's words with the Russians, you begin to see what Bernard Lewis meant with that.
Yes, no, it's such an important insight, and thank you for mentioning Bernard Lewis, because he's one we need to be taking counsel from. But I confess I'm not entirely sure what cock-a-snook means, but I suspect that Hugo Chavez is doing the same thing, whatever it is, to us in Latin America. Give us a quick riff on our own hemisphere and regional hegemons that might be filling vacuums of power being created by Barack Obama.
Yes, I think we've slid backwards there. I remember going to the Summit of the Americas, which was held in Quebec City just before September 11th, a couple of months before September 11th. And George W. Bush was very proud that the only country that wasn't there, wasn't represented, was Cuba. Yeah. Because for the first time, with the exception of Cuba, the Americas were wholly democratic. What we've seen since then is really a tin pot strongman who doesn't have much going for him other than his own estimation of his indispensability, has managed to hijack a nation and not just do that, but also to float out there on the wider stage and make ad hoc alliances, particularly with parts of the Muslim world, simply for the purposes of undermining American power. And I think the image of the American Gulliver tied down at every limb by these little Lilliputians is a good way of looking at the world. America finds it hard not just to impact upon the world in the Middle East or in Eastern Europe, but even in its backyard in Latin America. The American Gulliver has been tied down by these little Lilliputians individually who cumulatively are doing a good job at ending American order in the world.
Yes, and what's so worrying and yet so widely ignored, or at least misunderstood, is that the Lilliputians in our hemisphere are making common cause with these other would-be regional hegemons or sphere of influence establishers or simple tyrants, it's the combination of their virulent agendas that is particularly worrying. Before we leave, this marvelous tour d'horizon, which is filled with cocking of snooks, I think. China. Talk to us about China, Mark Steyn.
Yes, I think in the long run, I don't subscribe to theories that China is going to be the superpower of the 21st century. My line on China is that it will get old before it gets rich. That basically the one-child policy has saddled it with huge demographic problems that it cannot resolve in any easy way. Apart from anything else, it has this huge gender imbalance where you have millions and millions of young men for whom there aren't any young women. That isn't a recipe for social stability. I think I say in America alone that unless you're planning on becoming the first gay superpower since Sparta, it's almost bound to end disastrously there. But in the short to medium term, China is a significant player, in part because so much of America's future is mortgaged to China. And I think the dollar as the global currency is going to be one of the next big pressure points. That if you have, as appears to be happening, China, the wealthy Arab nations, and Russia getting together and effectively talking more and more openly about ending the dollar's role as the global reserve currency, then I think you risk, given the present levels of American domestic spending, of putting this country, essentially killing the American dream, saying the dream's over, it can never come back, we're in permanent, transgenerational, long-term economic despond because the Chinese have hauled the rug out from under us.
And we won't let that happen, will we? Mark Steyn, thank you for your vision, your acuity in that vision, and the humor as well with which you make it so penetrating. I appreciate so much you being with us, and I hope you will be a regular contributor to Secure Freedom Radio. You've illuminated so much today, and there's so much more to cover, and we look forward to doing it with you. That's it for today's installment of Secure Freedom Radio and our special edition with Mark Steyn. I hope you'll tune in tomorrow. The same time, the same station, including now streaming on WorldNet Daily, I'm very happy to report, for more of what you need to know to secure your freedom and that of those you love. For all of us here at Secure Freedom Radio, this is Frank Gaffney.